When we talk about American independence, most of us picture one date, July 4, 1776. Fireworks, parades, the Declaration of Independence, the moment we supposedly became free from British rule. But for people living around Long Island and the Connecticut shore, July 4 wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a long war. The Treaty of Paris, signed by the United States and Great Britain on September 3, 1783, ended the American Revolutionary War and recognized U.S. independence. And when British troops finally marched out of New York and off Long Island 2 months later, that wasn't a clean, happy ending either. It was the start of something different. Years of reacclimating, legal disputes and rebuilding. This episode is about that messy aftermath and about 4 very different experiences of going home. November 25th, 1783. In New York City, the last British soldiers march down to the docks, board their ships, and sail away. George Washington rides into the city at the head of American troops. Church bells ring, cannons fire. Crowds celebrate the end of 7 long years of occupation. Across Long Island Sound in Connecticut, families who fled Long Island years earlier wait for news. They've spent 7 years as refugees, renting rooms, borrowing land, raising children in a place that was never meant to be permanent. And suddenly, a hard question is right in front of them. Do we go home? To understand what that question really meant, we must look at 4 groups of people whose lives are tangled together along this stretch of water. Patriot rebels and refugees, Loyalists who considered themselves subjects of Great Britain, enslaved people, and Indigenous communities. Let's start with the Patriot refugees. Predominantly white people who left Long Island because they supported the American cause. Historians estimate that about 25% of the Long Island population evacuated to Connecticut and elsewhere. On paper, the Treaty of Paris sounded promising to facilitate their return. It included language about restoring property and protecting people who lived under British rule. With news of peace, refugees in Connecticut may have thought, we can go back, we can pick up where we left off. But that's not what they found. Families who crossed back discovered that home no longer looked like home. Fences had been torn down for firewood, fields were grazed bare or left choked with weeds. Woodlots were leveled for timber, orchards were neglected, livestock was gone. Long Island was no longer the quaint and quiet farmland they'd left behind. For 7 years, it had been used as a supply depot and garrison territory. The land was treated as military infrastructure without respect to family property and agriculture. And then there were neighbors. During the occupation, Loyalist families had survived partly by taking over abandoned Patriot farms, sometimes with British permission, sometimes simply because no one was there to stop them. So when a Patriot refugee stepped onto what used to be his 20 acres, he might find someone else living there. Someone who had supported the continuation of British rule, someone who had planted crops for themselves, someone who now believed they had a justifiable claim to the land. The state of New York passed a law called the Trespass Act, giving Patriot owners the right to sue people who had used their land during the war. It offered a path to compensation, but it also meant years of lawsuits, neighbor against neighbor, over rent, improvements, and wartime profits. For Patriot families, should we go home wasn't a sentimental question. It was a hard calculation. They had to weigh whether to return to face ruined property and legal battles, to stay in Connecticut where new roots were forming, or move on and start fresh somewhere else. Now consider the Loyalists. the people who supported or worked with British rule. For the colonies overall, historians estimate about 15 to 20% of colonists were Loyalists. But New York City and Long Island had especially high Loyalist concentrations, and so the local share may have been much higher. For them, the British evacuation felt like the floor dropping out from under them. They had considered themselves subjects of the Crown. With this British military loss, Loyalists found themselves in a crisis of identity. Some Loyalists boarded those ships with the departing British Army. They walked away from houses, shops, and farms, hoping the British Empire would take care of them somewhere else, in England, in Canada, or in other British colonies. Others stayed. Some kept a low profile, hoping Patriot neighbours would overlook their cooperation with the British. Others leaned on pre-war relationships, hoping old ties would lead to reconciliation or protection. But the mood had changed. Patriot victory meant new laws, new leaders, and a strong desire to punish people seen as traitors. Property they had seized might be restored to the rightful owners. Lawsuits could pile up. Social pressure could make you an outsider overnight. So Loyalists faced their own version of the home question. If they left with the British, they kept their allegiance, but lost homes where family had lived for several generations. If they stayed, they might keep their land, but live under suspicion, facing legal attacks and a community that might never truly accept them again. For enslaved people, the end of the war was never just about politics. It was about survival, and sometimes a risky hope for freedom. During the war, British officers offered protection and, in many cases, freedom to enslaved men and women who escaped Patriot masters and reached British lines. Thousands took that chance, leaving farms and households around Long Island and beyond. By 1783, many of those formerly enslaved men, women, and children stood in New York Harbor, insisting that their safety and their freedom depended on leaving with the British who had freed them. The peace treaty, though, included a clause that the British were supposed to evacuate without carrying away any Negroes. American slaveholders used that line to demand that people who had escaped to British protection be returned to them as property. British commanders often chose otherwise. They allowed many black Loyalists and formerly enslaved people to leave for Nova Scotia and other British colonies, creating a new diaspora of people whose home was now somewhere they had never seen. Meanwhile, on Long Island and in Connecticut, enslaved people who remained had to read a very different map. If their Patriot enslavers returned to Long Island, they went too, resuming forced labor on damaged, contested land. On their return, they found family and friends had been torn away in many cases, sold, escaped to who knows where, or emancipated by the British. If the family remained in Connecticut, they lived in a state moving slowly toward gradual emancipation, but not quickly enough to ensure freedom within their lifetimes. For enslaved people, should we go home wasn't about choosing between Long Island and Connecticut. It was about trying to see which direction, British, Patriot, or somewhere in between, held even a fragile path toward freedom, or at least a less dangerous kind of survival. Black and mixed-race people faced unfathomable challenges, not just in their bodies and labor, but in their minds and relationships. They had to live with constant uncertainty about who claimed them and what tomorrow would look like. A change in ownership or a rumor about evacuation could mean being sold away, marched to another town, or suddenly separated from children, parents, or partners. Every decision an enslaver made about going back to Long Island, staying in Connecticut, or moving on could rip apart the few fragile connections that made life bearable. They also endured the pain of seeing others leave for possible freedom while they remained behind. Some watched friends board British ships under promises of liberty or slip away in the chaos of war, while they stayed under close control. That could create a painful mix of hope, envy, grief, and fear. Hope that escape was possible, fear of punishment if they tried, and grief for loved ones whose fate they might never know. Socially, they moved through communities where they were essential and unwanted at the same time. Their labour rebuilt ruined farms and kept households functioning, yet they were denied basic recognition as full members of those communities. In Patriot and Loyalist towns alike, they had to read every glance and conversation, judging who might be a threat, who might offer small kindness, and who might be a possible ally in an escape or in securing better treatment. Indigenous communities along Long Island and the Connecticut shore had already lived through generations of European wars and pressure on their lands before the Revolution ever began. The American Revolution changed who claimed power, but it did not restore control to native nations. The peace treaty that Americans celebrate as the end of the war barely mentioned indigenous rights at all. It redrew borders between empires and the new United States, treating huge areas of native homelands as space for American expansion. During the Revolutionary War, British and American forces claimed and fought over lands that indigenous nations had cared for and governed for thousands of years. The war only changed who controlled each place. Meanwhile, tribes were driven from their ancient ancestral homes and marginalized into reservation lands without just compensation. After peace, when Patriot control returned and refugee families began to decide whether to go back, stay, or move inland, indigenous communities felt each of those choices. If Patriots went back to Long Island with renewed energy, they fenced and surveyed land more aggressively, reopening old boundary disputes with indigenous neighbors. If refugees stayed in Connecticut, they became permanent neighbors, turning temporary arrangements into long-term claims. If families moved westward, they joined a larger wave of settlers pressing into territories already occupied by native nations, thus expanding the program of genocide and dehumanization. For indigenous people, home wasn't a place they left for 7 years and then considered returning to. It was the place they were still trying to hold on to, while each new group of patriots, loyalists, and refugees added another layer of settlement and pressure. Today, when we look back on July 4, 1776, and November 25, 1783, it's tempting to tell a simple story. Declaring independence from Britain, widespread war, Patriot victory, the British troops leave and then everything is fine. But along both shores of Long Island Sound, those dates meant something far more complicated for the humans who populated that land. For Patriot refugees, going home meant ruined farms, angry neighbors, and years in court. Or it meant starting over somewhere new. For Loyalists, it meant a painful choice between exile and staying in a place that might never fully accept them. For enslaved people, it meant trying to read which route: British evacuation, Patriot return, or quiet survival in Connecticut, offered even a thin hope of freedom. For indigenous communities, it meant watching yet another round of settlement tighten around homelands that were already under strain. One stretch of water. 4 very different experiences of... In the next episode, we'll walk the actual fields and read the records of what returning landowners found. Ruined farms, contested claims, and a landscape where the aftermath of invasion played out in courts, communities, and memory for decades. If this kind of Northeast story helps you see independence differently, subscribe and share. Because the story of the Revolutionary War doesn't end when the fighting stops. And neither does the story of what home means along this shore.